Welcome back. Today we're diving into something really interesting that you sent us. A whole bunch of sources on Donald Trump's Make America Great Again vision.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and we're talking articles, policy proposals, expert opinions, even some historical data.
Sounds like a lot.
It is. It is.
Hmm.
So you want to know if America could really happen in the next 4 years. And honestly, after going through all of this, it's a lot more complicated than you might think.
I bet.
Yeah, we're covering everything from economic growth and healthcare to immigration, economic inequality, and America's role on the world stage. It's a lot.
It is quite a mix, and what's interesting is that they don't always agree, the sources. There are definitely some surprises in here.
There really are.
Maybe the best place to start is with the economy, the heart of the MAGA agenda.
Right.
Can those policies actually make America great again?
Well, a lot of people remember that initial economic boost during Trump's first term, right? We're talking tax cuts, deregulation, and that corporate tax rate getting slashed from 35% to 21%.
Big changes.
Yeah, but what did the sources say about the long-term impact of all that?
Well, some sources, like the Congressional Budget Office, projected that those tax cuts would actually increase the federal deficit by almost $1.9 trillion over the next decade.
Wow.
And research from the Federal Reserve indicated that a lot of the benefits from those tax cuts went straight to the wealthiest households, which actually made income inequality worse.
So short-term gain, but potential long-term pain. That's a tricky trade-off.
Definitely.
And speaking of tricky trade-offs, the sources also brought up how automation is going to completely reshape the economic landscape.
Ah,
Yeah. The McKinsey Global Institute predicts that by 2030, up to 375 million workers worldwide might have to switch careers because robots are taking over their jobs.
wow, that's a huge number.
It is a huge number.
Hmm.
So it's like we need to prepare the workforce for a future where robots are doing a lot of the jobs that exist today.
Precisely.
And that future might be closer than we think.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears a bit and talk about healthcare. This was a massive topic in the sources, and there's a lot of debate around Trump's efforts to dismantle the Affordable Care Act.
The ACA.
Right, or ACA, often called Obamacare.
Right.
It seemed like his plan caused a lot of confusion and uncertainty in the healthcare market.
It did. And the sources showed that while some people benefited from the changes, many others experienced negative consequences.
Oh, wow.
For example, the Kaiser Family Foundation reported that premiums for individual market health plans went up by a whopping 27% in 2018 alone.
It's a big jump.
It is, and rural areas in particular were hit hard.
Yeah, the sources painted a pretty bleak picture of healthcare in rural America. I remember reading about hospital closures,
Yeah.
limited access to specialists.
Right.
It sounds like there's a whole different reality for people seeking healthcare outside of major cities.
Absolutely. The North Carolina Rural Health Research Program found that a staggering 138 rural hospitals closed between 2010 and 2020.
That's a lot.
Imagine living in a community where the nearest hospital is miles away.
That's scary.
That's the reality for many Americans.
That's really concerning. And the sources also talked about how attempts to scale back Medicaid, a program that provides health coverage to low-income individuals and families, could have significant consequences.
Yes, and that's where some interesting contradictions emerge.
Oh.
You see, the Urban Institute estimated that expanding Medicaid in states that haven't already done so could actually cut the uninsured rate in half.
So expanding Medicaid could actually help more people get access to health care.
Exactly.
That seems to go against the idea of scaling it back.
It does, and what's even more fascinating is that studies by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation showed that Medicaid expansion actually boosted state economies.
How so?
They found that it created more jobs and reduced the burden on hospitals.
So it's not just about providing health care, it's about the economic ripple effects as well.
Right.
It's a really important point.
Yeah.
The sources also touched on the rise of telemedicine, which saw a huge surge during the pandemic, according to the American Hospital Association.
Telemedicine has the potential to revolutionize healthcare, especially in those rural areas we were talking about. Imagine if everyone, regardless of their location, had access to reliable internet and could consult with a doctor remotely.
That could be a game changer.
Definitely.
Now let's dive into another big issue, immigration.
Okay.
The sources went beyond just the talk of building walls and highlighted how immigrants actually contribute significantly to the U.S. economy, especially in areas like agriculture and new businesses.
Yes, the data is pretty clear on this. The Pew Research Center found that immigrants made up 17% of the workforce in 2019. And the Kauffman Foundation reported that immigrants were starting businesses at a remarkable rate. They're really driving entrepreneurship in many sectors.
That's a really valuable contribution, but the sources also pointed out how the focus on reducing illegal immigration created a strange situation,
It did.
almost a paradox.
Right.
Businesses were complaining they couldn't find enough workers, even while policies aimed at reducing illegal immigration were being implemented.
It's a tough situation.
It sounds like there's a real need for a more balanced approach to immigration policy,
I agree.
one that addresses security concerns, but also recognizes the economic benefits of immigration.
Absolutely. The sources suggest that expanding visa programs and creating pathways to legal residency could be beneficial for everyone involved.
So it's about finding a system that works for both the economy and national security.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered economic growth, healthcare, and immigration, all pretty complex issues with lots of different perspectives in the sources.
It is a lot to unpack.
What's next on our deep dive?
Well, let's move on to economic inequality. The sources acknowledge that Trump's policies did lead to job creation, but the big question is who really benefited from those jobs?
Right, because even if there are more jobs, if wages aren't keeping pace, that's a problem. And the sources seem to suggest that's exactly what happened.
The Institute for Policy Studies, for example, found that a large portion of those corporate tax savings we talked about earlier went right back into things like stock buybacks and executive bonuses.
So the money wasn't necessarily trickling down to the average worker?
And the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics data seems to back that up.
Really?
Yeah, it showed that real wages for lower-income workers barely moved during that time, while those at the very top continued to see their wealth increase.
So the rich got richer.
Exactly, and that growing gap between the rich and the poor has all sorts of negative consequences.
Like what?
It can lead to decreased consumer spending, limited access to healthcare and education, and even increased social unrest.
So it's not just an economic issue, it's a societal issue.
It is a big one.
The sources seem to point towards things like progressive tax reforms
Yeah.
as a way to address this inequality.
Yes, the data from the Tax Policy Center was pretty eye-opening.
In what way?
It showed that the wealthiest Americans were receiving massive tax cuts under Trump's policies. Progressive taxation, where those who earn more pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes, could generate revenue to invest in programs that benefit everyone, like education and infrastructure.
Yeah. It's about creating a more equitable system where everyone has a fair chance to succeed, regardless of their background.
That's the idea.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But what about America's role in the world? How did Trump's America First approach play out on the global stage?
That's a great question, and the sources offer some interesting insights into that.
Great, let's jump into that next.
It seems like Trump's America First policy caused, like you might imagine, some friction with our allies.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Like withdrawing from agreements, for example, like the Paris Climate Accord, that definitely didn't win us any popularity contests on the world stage.
Right, it seems like going it alone might not be the best strategy for global leadership.
Right.
But the sources did bring up some compelling arguments for focusing on national interests.
They did. It is a complex issue.
It is.
On the one hand, prioritizing our own needs can seem practical, but on the other hand, ignoring global responsibilities can have serious consequences. Like the pandemic, for instance. Really highlighted how interconnected we all are.
Yeah.
How important international cooperation is.
Makes sense.
You think about things like vaccine distribution and sharing critical information. None of that works if countries aren't willing to work together.
That's a good point. So if America First isn't the answer, what does it actually take to be a global leader in today's world? What do the sources have to say about that?
The sources emphasize the importance of building strong alliances, engaging in diplomacy, and taking a leadership role in tackling global challenges.
Okay.
It's about finding that balance between our own needs and the needs of the world.
Right.
We can't isolate ourselves,
No.
but we also need to make sure we're protecting our own interests.
That balance seems really tricky. And honestly, after going through all these sources, I'm struck by how often this idea of balance comes up.
Yeah.
Whether it's the economy, healthcare, or immigration. It seems like the real challenge is finding solutions that address all sides of these complex issues.
You're absolutely right. It's not about simple answers or one-size-fits-all policies.
No.
The sources really drive home the need for nuanced approaches that consider all the different perspectives and potential consequences.
So going back to the original question, can Trump make America great again? Based on everything we've discussed, It seems like some of his policies might have had some initial appeal and even some short-term successes.
That's true, but the sources also suggest that achieving true greatness requires a much deeper, more thoughtful approach.
So it's about more than just economic growth.
Right. It's about balancing that growth with equity, ensuring everyone benefits, not just those at the top.
And it's about recognizing that we can't ignore the rest of the world. We have a responsibility to be a global leader, working with other nations to address the challenges we all face.
Exactly. It's about understanding that greatness isn't a destination, it's an ongoing process.
How interesting.
It's about constantly striving to be better, to do better, to create a more just, equitable, and sustainable world for everyone.
Wow, that's a pretty profound thought.
It is something to think about.
So after this deep dive, what can we say about the MAGA vision? Is it achievable?
Well, the sources we've looked at today paint a complicated picture.
Yeah.
They highlight both the potential benefits and the potential pitfalls of the MAGA agenda.
Right.
Ultimately, whether or not it can be achieved depends on how we define greatness.
Yeah.
What trade-offs we're willing to make as a nation.
And that brings us back to you, the listener.
Right.
You sent us these sources because you wanted to understand this complex issue. What stood out to you the most? What surprised you? What made you think differently?
We've given you a lot to consider today, but this is just the beginning.
Right.
There's so much more to explore and unpack.
Definitely.
Keep asking questions, keep seeking out different perspectives, and keep engaging in these important conversations.
Because ultimately the future of America, and indeed the world, depends on all of us being informed, engaged, and willing to work together to create a better future.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
You know, one of the things that really struck me as we went through these sources is just how much the definition of greatness itself is being challenged.
That's a really interesting observation. It seems like everyone agrees America should be great, but there's no clear consensus on what that actually looks like anymore.
Exactly. For some, it's purely about economic indicators, like GDP growth and low unemployment.
Right.
But for others, true greatness means addressing social issues like poverty and inequality. And of course, there's that whole global leadership piece we talked about. What role should America play in the world? What are our responsibilities beyond our own borders?
It's almost like we're having an identity crisis on a national scale.
Really is.
We know we want to be great,
Yeah.
but we're not sure what that means anymore in a world that's so different than it was even a few decades ago.
And the sources we have really highlight how interconnected all of these different aspects of greatness are. You can't just focus on economic growth without considering the social and global consequences.
Right. It's like a giant puzzle where all the pieces are intertwined.
It's definitely complex. Speaking of complex, we spent a lot of time talking about the economy, but we didn't really dive into the specific policies that were proposed.
You're right, and that's something you might want to explore further, listener.
Yeah.
What were the actual strategies for achieving economic growth under the MAGA vision?
Good question.
Were they focused on deregulation, tax cuts, investment in certain industries? Digging into those details might give you a better understanding of the potential benefits and drawbacks.
And don't forget about the social implications. The sources talked about how economic policies can have a ripple effect on things like education, healthcare, and even social mobility. It's not just about numbers.
Right.
It's about people's lives.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to this idea of balance. How do we create an economic system that's both dynamic and fair? How do we ensure that everyone has the opportunity to succeed, not just a select few?
These are big questions.
Yeah.
And there are no easy answers. But the sources do offer some potential solutions. Things like investing in education and job training, promoting entrepreneurship, and creating a more progressive tax system.
Those are just a few examples.
Right?
The key is to keep exploring.
Yeah.
Keep learning.
Keep asking those tough questions.
Exactly.
And speaking of tough questions, let's revisit healthcare.
Okay.
It's a topic that comes up again and again in these sources.
It does.
It seems like there's a real struggle to find a system that works for everyone.
There is. And a lot of the debate centers around the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare,
Right.
and the attempts to repeal and replace it.
Right. And the sources show that those efforts had mixed results, with some people benefiting and others facing higher costs or even losing coverage altogether.
And we can't forget about the impact on rural communities.
Right.
Those hospital closures we discussed earlier are a stark reminder of the healthcare disparities that exist in this country.
It's like there are two different healthcare realities. One for urban areas and one for rural areas. That's not acceptable. So what are some of the potential solutions that were discussed in the sources?
Well, there are a variety of approaches, ranging from expanding Medicaid to promoting telemedicine and encouraging innovation in healthcare delivery. But again, there's no easy fix. It's going to require a willingness to experiment, to learn from our mistakes, and to keep working towards a system that truly serves all Americans.
It's a complex issue, but it's one that we can't afford to ignore. Healthcare is a fundamental human right, and we need to find a way to make it accessible and affordable for everyone.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another crucial piece of the puzzle, economic inequality.
Right, we touched on this earlier, but it's worth digging a little deeper.
Okay.
The source has really highlighted how the gap between the rich and the poor continues to widen in this country.
And that has profound implications, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole.
Oh, wow.
It can lead to decreased social mobility, increased crime rates, and a decline in overall well-being.
That's like a vicious cycle.
It is.
The more inequality we have, the harder it is to break out of poverty and achieve the American dream.
Right.
And that undermines the very fabric of our society.
Exactly. And the sources suggest that addressing economic inequality requires a multifaceted approach.
Like what?
It's about creating more opportunities for education and job training, ensuring a living wage, and promoting policies that support working families.
So it's about leveling the playing field so that everyone has a fair shot at success.
Right.
And it's about recognizing that a healthy economy is one where everyone benefits, not just those at the top.
And that brings us back to that question of what greatness really means. Is it about individual wealth and achievement, or is it about creating a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive?
It's a question worth pondering, and it's one that the sources we've discussed today challenge us to grapple with. There's no easy answers, but the conversation itself is incredibly valuable. So, listener, what are your thoughts? What does greatness mean to you, and how do you think we can achieve it as a nation?
We've given you a lot to think about today, but this is just the beginning. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better future, because ultimately the fate of America rests in our hands.
Well said. And on that note, it's time to move on to our final topic, global leadership.
Okay.
We've already talked about how America First might not be the most effective approach.
Right, and the sources we've looked at suggest that true global leadership requires a more nuanced, collaborative approach.
So what does that look like in practice? What specific actions could help America regain its position as a global leader?
Well, the sources point to a number of key strategies,
Right.
such as re-engaging in diplomacy, rebuilding trust with our allies, taking a leadership role in addressing global challenges like climate change and pandemics, and promoting democracy and human rights around the world.
It sounds like it's about more than just military might or economic dominance.
It is. It's about building relationships, fostering cooperation, and working together to solve the problems that affect us all.
But didn't Trump's America First approach alienate a lot of our allies? Pulling out of agreements like the Paris Climate Accord didn't exactly make us popular on the international stage.
That's true, and the sources acknowledge that damage was done. However, they also suggest that there are ways to repair those relationships and rebuild trust.
So it won't be easy, but it's essential if we want to be an effective global leader.
Exactly.
So what are some of the concrete steps that could be taken to repair those relationships? What did the sources suggest?
Well, some of the recommendations included rejoining international agreements that were abandoned, engaging in meaningful dialogue with our allies, and demonstrating a commitment to shared values and goals.
It's about showing the world that we're not just interested in our own self-interest, but that we're willing to work together for the common good.
Exactly. And that's a message that resonates with people all over the world.
Right.
When America leads with compassion, integrity, and a genuine desire to make the world a better place, others are more likely to follow.
That makes sense, but how do we balance that global leadership role with our own national interests? Seems like a delicate balancing act.
It is, and the sources emphasize the importance of finding that sweet spot where we're both protecting our own interests and contributing to the global community.
It's not an either proposition.
Right.
It's about finding a way to do both.
Exactly.
So what does that look like in practice? Can you give us some examples?
Sure. For example, when it comes to trade, we can negotiate agreements that are fair to both American workers and our trading partners.
Okay.
We can invest in international development programs that promote economic growth and stability around the world, which ultimately benefits us as well.
Right.
And we can take a leadership role in addressing global challenges like climate change, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's in our own self-interest to do so.
It's about recognizing that our own well-being is inextricably linked to the well-being of the rest of the world.
Precisely, and that's a message that seems to be gaining traction. More and more people are realizing that we're all in this together, and that our own future depends on creating a more just equitable and sustainable world for everyone.
It's a powerful message and one is worth amplifying. So, listener, as you continue to explore these issues, ask yourself, what kind of global leader do you want America to be?
Mm.
And what role can you play in shaping that future?
Because the world is watching, and the choices we make today will have a profound impact on the years to come.
Well said. And now let's talk about something that's been lurking in the background of all these discussions, the Make America Great Again slogan itself.
Okay?
The sources we have suggest that it's become incredibly divisive, almost like shorthand for a whole set of political beliefs.
It's true, and it's fascinating how this slogan has evolved and taken on a life of its own. What started as a campaign slogan has become a symbol, a rallying cry, and for some, even a source of identity.
And it's important to remember that not everyone interprets it the same way.
Right.
For some, Make America Great Again evokes a sense of nostalgia.
A simpler time.
Yeah, a longing for a simpler time. For others,
Yeah.
it's a call to action, a demand for change.
Mhm.
And of course, for some, it's seen as exclusionary,
Right.
a rejection of progress and diversity.
The sources don't shy away from these different interpretations.
Right.
They acknowledge that the MAGA slogan has become a cultural touchstone, a lens through which people view the world and their place in it.
And it's created this situation where even having a conversation about these issues can be incredibly challenging. It's like people are talking past each other, unable to find common ground.
It's a real communication breakdown,
It is.
and it's something that we as a society need to figure out how to overcome. If we can't even agree on what we're talking about, how can we ever hope to find solutions?
Right. It's like the sources are challenging us to move beyond the slogans and the rhetoric and really engage with the substance of these issues.
Exactly, and that means being willing to listen to perspectives that might be different from our own, to acknowledge the complexities and the nuances, and to recognize that there's rarely a simple answer.
It's about embracing the messiness of it all, right?
Right.
The world isn't black and white, and neither are these issues. We need to be willing to have those difficult conversations, even if they're uncomfortable.
Absolutely, and we need to be willing to challenge our own assumptions and biases.
Yes, true.
None of us have all the answers, and the only way we're going to find solutions is by working together.
And that starts with listening to each other, trying to understand where we're coming from, and finding that common ground. So, listener, as you continue to explore these issues, remember that it's okay to disagree, but it's also important to be respectful of different perspectives. We can learn a lot from each other, even when we don't see eye to eye.
And who knows, maybe through dialogue and understanding, we can start to bridge those divides and find a way forward together. That's the hope, anyway.
It's a hope worth holding on to, and it's a hope that's reflected in the sources we've discussed today. Despite the challenges and the complexities, there's a sense of optimism, a belief that we can create a better future if we're willing to work for it.
And that's a powerful message to leave our listeners with.
It is.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep believing in the possibility of a better tomorrow.
Because the future is not predetermined.
Right.
It's up to all of us to shape it. You know, it's interesting how that slogan, Make America Great Again, has become such a lightning rod.
It really has. And, I think the sources we looked at today do a good job of highlighting why.
Why is that?
Well, the slogan itself is so open to interpretation.
Oh, yeah?
What does it mean to make America great again?
Right.
When was America great before?
Good question.
What needs to be done to restore that greatness?
Right.
And these are all questions that people answer in very different ways, depending on their values and experiences and beliefs.
And it seems like those different interpretations have led to a lot of misunderstanding and division.
Absolutely. The slogan has become a symbol, a rallying cry, and for some even a source of identity. But it's also become a source of conflict and polarization. It's almost like it's impossible to have a rational conversation about what it means to be great as a nation.
So how do we move beyond that? How do we get past the slogans and the rhetoric and start having meaningful conversations about the issues that really matter?
Well, I think the sources we've looked at today offer some clues.
Okay.
They emphasize the importance of listening to each other, acknowledging different perspectives, and being willing to engage in respectful dialogue even when we disagree.
It's about recognizing that we're all Americans, even if we have different ideas about what that means.
Exactly. And it's about understanding that there's no one right answer, no single path to greatness.
Right.
It's a journey, a process, and it's one that we need to undertake together.
So what does that journey look like? What are some of the specific steps we can take to bridge those divides and start working towards a shared vision of greatness?
Well, I think it starts with education. We need to educate ourselves about the issues, about different perspectives, about the history of our country.
Yeah.
We need to understand where we've been, where we are now, and where we want to go.
And we need to be willing to challenge our own assumptions and biases.
Absolutely. We all have blind spots and we all have things to learn.
Right.
The more we're willing to listen to each other, the more we can grow and evolve as individuals and as a nation.
And that growth and evolution is essential if we want to create a truly great America.
It is, because greatness isn't a static thing.
It's not.
It's not about clinging to the past or trying to recreate some idealized version of history. It's about constantly striving to be better, to do better, to create a more just, equitable, and sustainable world for ourselves and for future generations.
That's a powerful vision, and I think one that resonates with a lot of people, regardless of their political beliefs.
I think so too, because ultimately we all want the same things.
We do.
We want a country that's strong and prosperous, a country that's fair, and just a country that's a force for good in the world.
And we can achieve that, but it's going to take all of us working together.
It will, but I think we're up to the challenge. I think the American people have a deep reservoir of resilience, creativity, and compassion. And I believe that if we can tap into those qualities, we can overcome any obstacle and build a future that's worthy of the name great.
Well said. And on that note of hope and possibility, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today,
Yeah,
but this is just the beginning of the conversation.
it is. And we encourage you, listener, to continue exploring these issues, to keep asking questions, and to keep engaging in those difficult but necessary conversations.
Because the future of America depends on it.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, keep diving deep.